At 4:17 in the morning, while the rest of Manhattan slept beneath rain-streaked windows and empty avenues, one woman sat alone in a room filled with dying screens, watching a billion-dollar company collapse in real time. She had spent the last 6 hours fighting off one of the most aggressive cyberattacks the firm had ever faced. She stopped it. She saved the servers, the customer accounts, the payroll systems, and perhaps the company itself. By sunrise, she expected gratitude. Instead, her CEO handed her a termination letter and told security to escort her out. What happened in those hours would trigger a federal investigation, expose a staged cyberattack, and reveal how the greatest threat to the company had never come from overseas hackers, but from inside its own executive floor. This story is inspired by real patterns in corporate cybercrime, insider threats, and whistleblower retaliation cases documented by federal prosecutors and investigative reports. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Her name, for the sake of this story, is Rachel Carter. 41 years old. Raised in Ohio. Educated at Purdue. One of those rare professionals who built her career quietly, without headlines, without ego, and without shortcuts. For over a decade, Rachel worked in cybersecurity, moving from analyst roles to executive-level incident response. She wasn't the kind of person who sought praise. She preferred logs over meetings, code over politics, solutions over speeches. When TitanCore Financial Systems recruited her as Director of Cyber Defense in 2021, they marketed the company as one of the fastest-growing financial infrastructure firms in America. Their software-powered payroll systems, payment processors, and retirement account management for thousands of businesses nationwide. To the outside world, TitanCore was a symbol of American innovation. Internally, Rachel would learn it was built on pressure, image, and carefully managed appearances. From her first week, Rachel noticed something unusual. The company spent heavily on public relations, but hesitated on critical security upgrades. Legacy systems were patched rather than replaced. Internal audit reports were delayed. Executives often pushed for deadlines over safeguards. She raised concerns, documented vulnerabilities, and requested broader authority to modernize defenses. The board approved some changes, but one man resisted nearly every recommendation: CEO Daniel Whitmore. Charismatic, polished, and known for delivering aggressive quarterly growth, Whitmore had become the face of TitanCore. Investors loved him. Business magazines praised him. Employees feared him. Rachel described him later as a man who treated caution like weakness. If something slowed revenue, he wanted it removed. If someone challenged him publicly, they rarely stayed long. Still, Rachel stayed. She believed in the mission. More importantly, she believed she could protect the people who depended on TitanCore systems. That included small business owners, retirees, hospitals, and local governments. If TitanCore failed, the consequences would ripple far beyond one corporate headquarters. So she built stronger firewalls, redesigned incident protocols, and assembled a lean but highly capable cyber response team. Over 18 months, they prevented dozens of intrusion attempts, some routine, others highly coordinated. By early 2024, Rachel had become one of the company's most valuable assets. Yet inside executive meetings, her growing influence created tension. Her insistence on transparency clashed with leadership's obsession with optics. Then came the night everything changed. It began just after midnight on a Thursday in late October. Rachel had gone home less than 2 hours earlier when her phone erupted with priority alerts. Multiple unauthorized access attempts were hitting TitanCore's infrastructure simultaneously. Within minutes, ransomware signatures appeared across segmented servers. Financial transaction systems began freezing. Customer-facing portals crashed. Internal messaging channels filled with panic. This was no phishing scam or amateur intrusion. Whoever was inside understood enterprise architecture and knew where to strike for maximum disruption. Rachel drove straight back to headquarters. By 12:43 a.m., she was in the network command center, directing containment measures. External gateways were severed. Backup systems isolated. Infected nodes quarantined. Her team worked through layers of encryption and access tunnels while executives demanded updates every 10 minutes. Millions of records were at risk. If the breach spread to payroll databases, clients across the country would wake up unable to pay employees. If retirement portfolios were corrupted, legal exposure would be catastrophic. For 6 relentless hours, Rachel held the line. Then, in the middle of tracing the attacker's movement, she found something that made her stop. The intrusion had bypassed several authentication barriers, not through brute force, but through executive-level authorization. Clean credentials. No failed attempts. No suspicious escalation logs. Someone with top-tier access had opened the door. Rachel initially assumed those credentials had been stolen, but the timestamps didn't fit. The access token originated from inside the corporate VPN, specifically routed through a private terminal registered to the executive floor. She pulled the metadata. The source identifier was linked to the CEO's office. Rachel said nothing. She quietly began preserving logs before anyone could alter them. Hidden transfer paths appeared in the system architecture, channels that had existed for months, perhaps longer. Offshore endpoints were receiving encrypted bundles disguised as maintenance traffic. Deleted records suggested attempts to erase traces before the attack even began. This was no random cybercrime that IT looked orchestrated. At 6:12 a.m., with the breach contained, Rachel expected an emergency board session. Instead, she was summoned to the 28th floor conference room. Waiting inside were legal counsel, human resources, and Daniel Whitmore. He thanked her for her efforts, then slid a sealed envelope across the polished table. Inside was a termination notice, effective immediately. The stated reasons: violation of executive protocol, unauthorized forensic activity, and reputational risk to the company. Her credentials were revoked before she finished reading. Her security badge was disabled. She was escorted from the building she had just spent the night defending. No applause. No acknowledgement. No explanation. Only silence. By noon, TitanCore issued a press statement describing the cyberattack as an external criminal event successfully managed by leadership. Rachel's name was absent. Internally, staff were informed that she had been dismissed for procedural misconduct. Most people would have walked away. Rachel did not, because before leaving the command center, she had copied evidence to a secure legal archive. And within days, she filed a whistleblower complaint with federal regulators. What investigators would uncover in the months that followed mirrored real-world insider threat and extortion cases prosecuted in the United States, where employees and executives manipulated cyber incidents for financial gain, concealment, or leverage. The attack, according to investigators, had likely been staged. Its purpose was not ransom. It was cover. Cover for irregular fund transfers, accounting discrepancies, and unauthorized offshore holdings tied to shell entities. Rachel's discovery threatened to expose all of it. That is why she had to disappear from the company narrative before she could speak. But she already had. And the people who believed they had buried the truth were about to learn a lesson many corporations underestimate in the weeks that followed her termination. Rachel Carter became a ghost in the very industry she had spent years helping to secure. Recruiters who had once called weekly suddenly stopped responding. Professional contacts grew distant. Invitations to conferences disappeared. Quietly, efficiently, her reputation was being dismantled. TitanCore had not only removed her from the building, they were attempting to remove her from the conversation entirely. And for a while it worked. Corporate statements painted her as unstable under pressure. Anonymous leaks suggested she had violated security protocol during the attack. Online forums began circulating speculation that she had been partly responsible for the breach itself. It was a deliberate campaign, one designed to isolate her before any official inquiry could gain traction. But Rachel understood something they underestimated. Facts, when preserved properly, are harder to erase than people. She spent the next month building her case. Every access log, every timestamp, every hidden route she had copied before leaving headquarters was cataloged and verified. She cross-referenced offshore IP addresses with known shell corporations. She matched internal authorizations to board-level permissions. She reconstructed the timeline of the attack minute by minute. What emerged was not simply evidence of negligence, it was evidence of coordination. Transfers totaling tens of millions of dollars had been routed through intermediary accounts during the exact window of the cyber incident. Those transactions were masked by the same system disruptions that executives publicly blamed on foreign hackers. In essence, the attack created the smoke while money moved through the fire. Rachel submitted her findings to federal regulators, including the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. At first, the response was procedural and slow. Whistleblower filings often are. But one detail changed everything: a hidden server mirror she had discovered during the breach. It contained archived financial snapshots from months prior, records that should have been inaccessible. Those snapshots revealed discrepancies in reported earnings, inflated revenue declarations, and liabilities concealed from shareholders. TitanCore was not just managing a cybersecurity crisis. It had been presenting a false financial image to investors for at least 2 fiscal years. Once investigators examined the mirror data, the case accelerated. Subpoenas were issued. Bank records were requested. Digital forensics teams were assigned. And suddenly, what had begun as a dismissed complaint from a terminated employee became a high-priority corporate fraud investigation. Inside TitanCore, panic spread faster than the original breach. Daniel Whitmore held emergency executive sessions, insisting the inquiry was routine and would be resolved quickly. He instructed department heads to maintain normal operations and publicly reaffirm confidence in the company's stability. Yet internally, employees noticed unusual behavior. Legal teams worked overnight. Compliance officers were excluded from key meetings. Several senior managers resigned without explanation. One board member abruptly sold a significant portion of personal holdings weeks before the investigation became public. To outsiders, these events looked unrelated. To investigators, they formed a pattern. Then came the leak. An anonymous source sent financial journalists an internal memorandum authored 6 months before the attack. The memo outlined contingency planning for a controlled disruption event intended to justify emergency restructuring and insurance recovery. Buried in technical language was a recommendation to use cyber incident framing as a shield against regulatory scrutiny. The wording was careful, but the implication was devastating. Someone within TitanCore had considered using a cyberattack narrative as strategic cover long before the October breach ever occurred. When the memo reached the press, public confidence collapsed. Major clients suspended contracts. Shareholders demanded independent audits. News outlets began connecting TitanCore's attack to broader questions of insider fraud. For the first time, Rachel Carter's name entered the national conversation, not as a suspect, but as the whistleblower who had warned authorities before the story broke. Daniel Whitmore responded with a televised interview. Calm, composed, and visibly irritated, he dismissed the allegations as a coordinated smear campaign led by a disgruntled former employee. He denied any wrongdoing, claimed the company was the victim of external criminals, and framed Rachel as someone unable to accept accountability. For a brief moment, his confidence reassured some investors. But that confidence would not survive what investigators uncovered next. A forensic audit traced one of the offshore accounts to a consulting entity indirectly linked to Whitmore's personal trust. Additional transfers connected 2 board advisors and a senior finance executive. The money had moved in layered stages, concealed through vendor agreements and emergency disbursement authorizations. More importantly, those authorizations were signed during the exact hours of a cyberattack, using executive credentials tied to Whitmore's office. Rachel had been right from the beginning. The breach was not designed to steal from TitanCore. It was designed to distract from what TitanCore's own leadership was stealing. Federal agents executed search warrants across multiple offices. Devices were seized. Internal communications were recovered. One deleted exchange, later cited in court filings, discussed the need to neutralize operational liabilities after the incident. Investigators argued that phrase referred to Rachel herself. She had become a threat the moment she preserved evidence. Within days, Daniel Whitmore resigned as CEO. He issued a statement citing personal reasons. No one believed it. Arrests followed 2 weeks later. Charges included securities fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and retaliation against a whistleblower. Prosecutors described the scheme as one of the most calculated uses of cyber deception in recent corporate history. The staged attack had served multiple purposes: conceal fraudulent transfers, trigger insurance claims, and create an external villain while insiders profited. For many watching the case unfold, the revelation was staggering. The company had spent millions strengthening digital defenses against outsiders, while the greatest threat sat inside executive offices. Rachel Carter became the prosecution's central witness. Her logs, preserved with precision, formed the backbone of the case. Her timeline dismantled defense arguments. Her testimony explained how technical evidence exposed financial misconduct hidden beneath a manufactured crisis. In court, she spoke with the same calm clarity that had defined her career. No bitterness, no theatrics, just facts. And facts were enough. The jury returned guilty verdicts on multiple counts. Several executives accepted plea agreements. Whitmore received a federal prison sentence and substantial financial penalties. Shareholders filed civil suits that reshaped corporate governance standards in the sector. TitanCore survived as a company, but only after leadership was dismantled and operations restructured under independent oversight. As for Rachel Carter, she never returned to TitanCore. Instead, she founded a consulting firm specializing in insider threat detection and executive accountability. Organizations that once overlooked her now sought her expertise. Universities invited her to lecture on corporate ethics in cybersecurity. Industry leaders cited her case as proof that security failures often begin not in code, but in culture. Her story became a warning, because the lesson was never simply about hackers. It was about power, about how institutions protect themselves when truth becomes inconvenient, about how the people who expose corruption are often punished before they are believed, and about how, in the end, systems built on deception eventually collapse under the weight of their own records. Rachel Carter was fired before sunrise for doing exactly what she was hired to do. She protected the company. She followed the evidence. She refused to look away. And in doing so, she revealed that the most dangerous breach was never in the firewall. It was in the boardroom. Even after the convictions, Rachel Carter's life did not return to normal. Justice in court does not erase what betrayal does to a person. For months, she lived under intense scrutiny. News outlets wanted interviews. Tech conferences wanted exclusive appearances. Publishers approached her with book deals. But none of that changed the fact that the institution she had devoted years to had tried to destroy her for telling the truth. The legal victory gave her credibility, but it did not restore the years of trust she had lost in corporate leadership. Friends inside TitanCore admitted they had stayed silent because they feared retaliation. Some apologized. Others never reached out. Rachel understood their fear, but she never forgot their silence. What few people knew was that during the investigation, Rachel had received multiple warnings. Anonymous emails urged her to withdraw her complaint. A black SUV sat outside her apartment for 3 consecutive nights. Her attorney advised increased security measures. At one point, investigators informed her that certain executives had discussed private surveillance to assess her next moves. While none of those threats resulted in formal charges, they revealed the extent of desperation inside TitanCore's leadership circle. Rachel later said the intimidation was more frightening than the attack itself because it confirmed one truth: corruption rarely ends quietly. As the case became national news, broader questions emerged. How many other companies had disguised financial misconduct behind cybersecurity incidents? How often were technical failures blamed on foreign attackers when the real breach came from executive misconduct? Federal agencies launched parallel reviews into several firms operating under similar structures. Rachel's testimony was cited in policy discussions around whistleblower protections and digital accountability. Her case shifted industry conversations in ways few had anticipated. She had not only exposed TitanCore, she had forced corporate America to confront a vulnerability it rarely acknowledged. Yet the most emotional moment came long after the headlines faded. Nearly 2 years after the trial, Rachel received a handwritten letter from a former TitanCore employee. It was from a payroll supervisor in Kansas City, someone she had never met personally. The woman wrote that during the October attack, her department had feared thousands of employees across small businesses would go unpaid. Rachel's actions had prevented that disaster. Because the system stayed operational, local workers got their checks on time. Families paid rent. Groceries were bought. Lives continued uninterrupted. The writer thanked Rachel for protecting people she would never know. Rachel kept that letter framed in her office. Because for all the lawsuits, testimony, and national attention, that letter reminded her what the story was truly about: not corporate fraud, not executive greed, but ordinary people who would have suffered if she had failed. And that is what makes this story unforgettable. She entered that building as a cybersecurity director. She left as a scapegoat. She returned as the witness who dismantled an empire. But perhaps the most remarkable part of Rachel Carter's story is not that she exposed corruption. It is that she chose to act when silence would have been easier. Most people, when faced with power, step back. She stepped forward. And history often turns on those moments when one person refuses to ignore what everyone else is willing to excuse. Because the truth is this: the hackers were real, but they were only part of the story. The greater theft was trust. The greater crime was betrayal. And the greatest threat to any institution is never the outsider trying to break in. It is the insider convinced they will never be held accountable. So the next time you hear about a company under attack, ask yourself one question: who benefits from a chaos? Because sometimes the loudest alarm is the one designed to distract you, and sometimes the hero saving the system is the very person they try hardest to erase. Was justice truly served in Rachel Carter's case? Or was prison only the beginning of accountability for a culture built on deception? Let us know what you think in the comments. And if this story changed the way you see corporate power, stay with us. To erase. Was justice truly served in Rachel Carter's case? Or was prison only the beginning of accountability for a culture built on deception? Let us know what you think in the comments. And if this story changed the way you see corporate power, stay with us, because the next case may be even harder to believe. Months after the verdict, Rachel Carter tried to move on. But moving on is rarely simple when your name becomes tied to one of the most public corporate scandals in the country. She had become a symbol of resilience, of whistleblowing, of integrity under pressure, but symbols often carry a burden the public never sees. Invitations poured in from major firms seeking her expertise, yet every offer came with the same underlying question. Could they trust someone who had once exposed her own company? It was the irony of her situation. The very courage that made her valuable also made institutions wary. Rachel understood this immediately. Corporate America admired accountability in theory, but feared it in practice. She accepted selective consulting roles and built her firm carefully, refusing clients who wanted optics instead of reform. Her mission was simple: identify the weaknesses companies ignored because they originated from leadership rather than technology. Insider threats, executive overreach, manipulated audits, these were her focus. She had lived through the consequences of all three. Her first major contract came from a healthcare technology company concerned about compliance failures. During her assessment, Rachel discovered executive expense laundering tied to vendor contracts. It was smaller in scale than TitanCore, but the pattern was familiar. Once again, the issue was not hackers, it was unchecked authority. Word spread. Soon, Rachel Carter became one of the most sought-after experts in executive accountability and digital ethics. Universities invited her to lecture. Federal advisory panels requested testimony. Industry conferences placed her on keynote stages. Her speeches were direct, disciplined, and often uncomfortable for those listening. She argued that cybersecurity was no longer just a technical issue, but a governance issue. The strongest firewalls in the world meant nothing if the people at the top weaponized access for personal gain. That message resonated deeply because audiences understood it came from lived experience. Yet even as her career expanded, one unresolved question remained: how much did Daniel Whitmore truly act alone? During trial proceedings, prosecutors secured convictions against several executives and board affiliates, but whispers persisted about deeper networks, investors, consultants, and external advisors who may have known far more than they admitted. Rachel had reviewed enough evidence to suspect the scheme extended beyond those publicly charged. Certain transactions led to entities that were never fully explained. Several offshore accounts were closed before subpoenas reached them. One consulting intermediary dissolved within days of the first arrests. Legally, the case was closed. But in Rachel's mind, pieces remained missing. That uncertainty followed her into 2023. One evening, nearly 18 months after the trial, she received an encrypted message through a secure reporting portal used by her firm. The sender was anonymous. Attached was a folder labeled simply TitanCore Legacy. Inside were internal documents, investor correspondence, and a series of financial projections predating the cyberattack by almost 2 years. The material suggested that TitanCore's fraudulent reporting had been discussed with outside stakeholders long before the staged breach. More disturbing was one memo outlining pressure from private equity backers, demanding aggressive returns regardless of legal exposure. It implied Daniel Whitmore had not conceived the operation alone. He may have been executing a broader expectation. Rachel contacted federal investigators. The documents were authenticated. A new inquiry quietly opened. For Rachel, the revelation confirmed what she had long suspected. Corporate misconduct rarely belongs to one individual. It survives because systems reward silence and distribute responsibility until no one feels fully accountable. Daniel Whitmore had been the face of TitanCore's collapse, but perhaps not its only architect. As investigators revisited dormant leads, Rachel learned another truth. Daniel Whitmore had been cooperating. In exchange for sentencing considerations, he had provided information about external partners involved in financial concealment strategies across multiple firms. His testimony remained sealed, but fragments reached regulatory circles. Several unrelated corporations soon announced sudden compliance reviews. Senior executives in other sectors resigned unexpectedly. Patterns emerged that mirrored TitanCore's structure: overstated earnings, cyber narratives used as distraction, and concealed liabilities routed through offshore channels. Rachel's case had not ended with one company that IT had exposed a template. By then, public interest reignited. Media outlets framed the story as evidence of systemic weaknesses in corporate oversight. Rachel was again asked to comment, but this time she approached carefully. She no longer wanted to be positioned as the lone hero. She insisted the broader issue mattered more than her personal journey. In interviews, she emphasized that accountability must extend beyond criminal prosecutions. Boards, investors, and regulators all shared responsibility when warning signs were ignored. Still, one event would define the final chapter of her relationship with TitanCore. In late 2024, a congressional oversight committee invited Rachel Carter to testify on corporate cyber fraud and whistleblower retaliation. The hearing drew national attention. Lawmakers questioned how companies could manipulate cybersecurity narratives for financial concealment. Rachel answered with precision, citing her experience without exaggeration. She explained how technical evidence, if understood properly, can reveal misconduct hidden beneath crisis messaging. She described the retaliation tactics used against her and the chilling effect such tactics have on future whistleblowers. Then one senator asked her a simple question. If you could speak directly to Daniel Whitmore today, what would you say? The room fell silent. Rachel paused. Then she answered, I would tell him that systems built on fear always believe loyalty can be purchased. But loyalty earned through trust lasts longer than any fraud ever could. And the people you silence are often the ones history remembers. The statement circulated widely. For many, it became the defining line of the hearings. For Rachel, it was closure. Not because it punished Daniel Whitmore further, but because it reframed the narrative. She was no longer the employee who had been fired. She was the professional whose integrity outlived the institution that tried to erase her. Years later, when business schools analyzed the TitanCore scandal, they focused on governance failures, cybersecurity misuse, and financial misconduct. But among students, one lesson always stood above the rest, that a company can survive external attacks. What it cannot survive is leadership that treats truth as a threat. Rachel Carter's story remains one of the clearest examples of that principle. She fought off hackers, yes, but the battle that mattered most came after the breach, when she chose evidence over fear and accountability over silence. Daniel Whitmore believed removing her would secure his future. Instead, it accelerated his downfall. TitanCore believed controlling the narrative would preserve its image. Instead, the records they buried became the proof that destroyed them. And Rachel Carter, the woman handed a termination letter at sunrise after saving a billion-dollar company, became the reason an entire corporate structure was forced into the light. Because in the end, the strongest defense against corruption was never software, encryption, or policy. It was one person willing to tell the truth and refuse to disappear. In the years that followed, the TitanCore scandal became required study material in cybersecurity programs, corporate governance seminars, and federal compliance workshops. Analysts dissected every layer of the operation, from the stage breach to the retaliatory firing, from the offshore transfers to the manipulated narratives. Yet for all the reports, legal summaries, and academic papers, the most discussed element remained surprisingly human. One decision made in the middle of the night by a woman who refused to ignore what she saw. Rachel Carter never described herself as courageous. In interviews, she often insisted she was simply doing her job. But that explanation, while modest, misses the deeper truth. Doing the right thing inside a compromised system is rarely simple. It requires accepting consequences before rewards exist. It means standing alone when institutions close ranks. It means understanding that truth may cost you your position, your comfort, and your certainty. Rachel paid all three. By 2025, reforms inspired in part by her testimony had strengthened whistleblower protections in several sectors tied to financial technology and digital infrastructure. Corporate boards were required to implement more independent cyber oversight committees. Insurance carriers revised payout standards for breach-related claims, demanding stricter forensic transparency. Federal agencies expanded insider threat investigations tied to executive access abuse. These were structural changes, quiet, technical, often overlooked by the public, but they mattered. They represented systems adapting because one case had exposed what complacency could no longer hide. Daniel Whitmore, meanwhile, faded from public relevance. His appeals failed. His financial empire dissolved under settlements and penalties. Former associates distanced themselves. The leadership image he had spent years constructing collapsed faster than anyone expected once scrutiny replaced admiration. In many ways, his downfall illustrated a familiar pattern. Power built on image survives only until evidence interrupts the performance. And then, in 2025, something unexpected happened. Rachel received a request for a private meeting. The sender was a former TitanCore board member, one who had resigned before charges were filed and had largely avoided public accountability. He wanted to apologize. Against the advice of colleagues, Rachel agreed. The meeting took place in a quiet law office in Chicago. The former board member, now retired, admitted that concerns had been raised internally months before the attack. Several directors suspected irregularities in reporting, but no one pushed hard enough. The pressure to preserve shareholder confidence outweighed ethical concerns. He confessed that when Rachel was terminated, some members understood it was retaliation but rationalized their silence as damage control. Then he said something Rachel would later repeat in speeches: "We told ourselves we were protecting the company. What we were really protecting was our own comfort." That sentence stayed with her because it explained far more than TitanCore. It explained institutions everywhere, how compromise rarely begins with grand crimes, but with small decisions to look away. Rachel left that meeting without anger, not because forgiveness erased the past, but because clarity replaced unanswered questions. She understood then that accountability is not only about punishment. It is about recognition, forcing people and systems to confront what they chose to excuse. In her later years, Rachel focused less on investigations and more on mentorship. She created programs for young professionals entering cybersecurity, emphasizing ethics as strongly as technical skill. She warned them that expertise alone is not enough if courage is absent. Firewalls can be built, systems can be restored, but character, once surrendered, is harder to recover. Her final keynote before retirement ended with a statement that many consider the defining lesson of her life. Organizations do not collapse the moment a hacker enters their network. They collapse when honesty becomes more threatening than deception. That line spread across industry circles because it captured the essence of her journey. Rachel Carter was never just the woman who fought off hackers. She was the witness to how power reacts when exposed. She was proof that integrity can outlast influence, and she was a reminder that the most important battles are often fought long after the crisis appears over. The night she was handed that termination letter, TitanCore believed it had ended her story. In reality, it had only written the first chapter, because the truth they tried to bury became the force that redefined industries, changed regulations, and reshaped how corporate accountability is understood. And perhaps that is the deepest irony of all. The company feared what Rachel Carter knew, but what destroyed them was not her knowledge. It was their belief that they could silence IT.so. When we ask whether justice was served, the answer may not lie in prison sentences or financial settlements. It lies in what remained afterward. A changed system, a remembered lesson, and a legacy built not on power but on principle. Rachel Carter lost her job at Sunrise, but she gained something far greater: the ability to prove that truth, when defended, can outlive every attempt to erase it. And that is why her story still matters, because somewhere in another boardroom, another crisis is unfolding. Another employee is seeing what should not be ignored, and another decision is waiting to be made. The question is, when that moment comes, who will choose courage?